Are you gonna thank the culinary program?
Oh, yes. Yes. I don't want to do it on this. I'll do it on the back of this thing. So we starting right at promptly at 5? What time should we?
Probably two.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's events. My name is Philip Chavez. I'm the Deputy Superintendent, a proud Deputy Superintendent of Edgewood Independent School District. I'd like to take this time to apologize. Our Superintendent of Schools, Dr. Eduardo Hernandez, is unable to make it tonight, and he is up in Yale studying with the Broad program. I have the honor to take his place tonight. Welcome to the Rodríguez versus San Antonio 50th anniversary commemoration. This entire process started back in 1968, right here in this very high school, starting with a student walkout. I know that we have several members that are going to be recognized later on in the program. But because of that, I want to say the subsequent summer, the Rodríguez versus San Antonio ISD case ensued. As you know, this was for equity and equality in the fact that the way school funding and revenue for districts is calculated is through the property tax, right? The day before yesterday, I actually went online to see what 1 penny Edgewood ISD can raise if we had that additional tax, and that was $185,000. I went on to look at Alamo Heights, which was part of the conversation back in 1973 when the Supreme Court decision came out, and they're currently at 1 penny garners $800,000. Another example I looked at was Northeast Independent School District. 1 penny garners $4.2 million. So obviously, property-rich districts to this day have a slight edge, if you will. But had we not had the Rodríguez case, or Demetrio Rodríguez, whose daughter, Patricia Rodríguez, currently works here in Edgewood ISD as a dyslexia teacher, we would have not had brought to light the disparities between equity in poor and marginalized districts. And Edgewood took that fight, and it's in the DNA of the residents and community of Edgewood to fight and to look at injustices and move forward. I can say we've come a long way since 1968, but there's still some challenges that are coming, and actually one that we're facing in the legislature today, and that's called the education account, right? Educational savings account, AKA a voucher. So just to say that, that's going to be another barrier that we're definitely going to have to address and be sure that we're on the forefront, Edgewood ISD, as always, in making sure that equity is maintained. I'd like to introduce at this point some individuals from Edgewood ISD, starting with our Board of Trustees. And if I can introduce, if you could stand up, please, Mr. Jose Guerra, Mr. Guerra, Mr. Michael, Mr. Gomez, Mr. Santoyo, and Mr. Valdez. I'd also like to introduce a former board president, Mr. Roy Soto, who will be here with us tonight. I'd also like to thank members of our administration. If you could stand up or raise your hand, who are in the audience here today, who assist the district in making many of the decisions in terms of ensuring that we have the best buck, our bang for our buck, if you will. I'd also like at this time, how about that jazz band? Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, I was in the audience circulating and I found a couple of people who were saying, how do we hire those individuals? Well, please don't hesitate. Please call. That can be arranged. Secondly, I'd like to thank our culinary arts students. How about that food? I spoke to Chef McCoy and I said, Chef, I've gone to 3 or 4 people who say they love your food. Do you mind if I? And she said, I've already got 3 requests to cater. So I just want to say about our culinary arts program, Chef McCoy brings in a catering service where the students are not only learning how to prepare food, but also how to market it and become an entrepreneur in that particular area. So I want to thank everyone. If I miss you, I apologize, but we need to go on with the festivities. And now I'd like to introduce the Master of Ceremonies, Dr. Enrique Aleman, Professor, Trinity.
Thank you, Mr. Chavez. It's great to see. What a great crowd. Um, I know it's been about 6 or 7 months that we started to talk about this with our partners at IDRA and with the school district, and to see it come to fruition, it's really an honor for us to be here today. Good afternoon. It is my honor to be here today as we gather to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Rodríguez versus San Antonio. As the director of the Center for Educational Leadership at Trinity University, I am proud that we were able to co-sponsor this event with our friends in the Edgewood ISD and IDRA. It is by acknowledging the tremendous cultural wealth in communities like San Antonio's West Side, and in recognizing the expert researchers and scholars like those at IDRA, that our center strives to create opportunities to learn our history, to build leadership capacity in schools and communities, and to challenge the injustices across P20 educational settings that continue to persist. The work of educational empowerment is not done, and our struggle to make educational policy more just continues with our partners in this community. Public schools in the state of Texas have never been funded equitably or adequately, especially when it comes to funding schools that are majority brown and black. The state has consistently been at or near the bottom in per pupil funding when compared to its counterparts from across the country. Those in power have designed a system that benefits the so-called haves and intentionally disadvantage those with less property wealth. At every step of the legislative and policymaking process, in every instance when parents and students wanted to improve the system to make it more equitable, those who have benefited generationally from an unequal system have blocked reform, or stalled improvements, or maneuvered either in the courts or in the legislature to prevent equal access to funding. This has been the long and consistent pattern, and it is the history of Texas school finance. But just as these tactics have been used by the powerful, community and parent leaders, school finance policy and legal experts, educators and district leaders, and student activists are also part of this history. They have resisted, they've called out the powerful, they've pushed back and challenged a schooling system that impacted them directly. And ultimately, they sued the state and its powerful policymakers for better schools. Today, we commemorate the 50th anniversary of Rodríguez versus San Antonio landmark Supreme Court case. It's a case that scholars have written about and researched, that policymakers have debated across the halls of the Texas Capitol, and that local communities have contended with in their school board meetings. It's also a landmark case because it demonstrated to the world that change in leadership can and does come from communities like this. And in fact, that if it were not for working class black and brown people who simply wanted what was fair and just, change would not happen. This public acknowledgement of our thank you to this community, but it is a public acknowledgement and thank you to this community, but it's also our way of reminding the next generation of leaders that this fight is not done. So this is our purpose today, to commemorate this landmark case, to remember our elders and thank them for their leadership, and to continue the work that was started more than 50 years ago. Our families, community leaders, and student activists have always fought against and resisted the intentional and unjust educational policies that have denied equal educational opportunity to generations of our students and family members. This is the story of Rodríguez case, a story of community organizing, of legal strategy, of parent leadership, of student activism. We celebrate the courageous students and families demanding better schools that built a movement and paved the way for the filing of the Rodríguez case. I'd like to ask all the student activists who are here today, not all of them were able to make it. I know there's some that are watching on Zoom or watching online. They walked out for educational equity. So as I call your names, we're going to read a partial list of them. I know we can't get everybody, but thanks to one of our partners in the community, Manuel Garza, we were able to get a list. So I'd like to acknowledge some of them. From Edgewood High School, class of 1968, Rosendo Gutierrez, Robert Bustos, Erlinda Cifuentes. From the Edgewood class of 1969, Diana Herrera, Richard Herrera, Rebecca Noriega Felan, Manuel Diaz Garza, Gilbert Zamora. From the Edgewood class of 1970, Zulema Sanchez, Rebecca Peña Ortiz. From JFK High School, class of 1970, David D. Garza. From Lanier High School, Edgar Lozano, class of 69, Homer Garcia, class of 69, and Andrea Velasquez, class of 68. We also had other high schools around San Antonio. From Southside High School, class of 1969, Ana Bustamante, and from Harlandale ISD, former Congressman Ciro Rodríguez. We had community organizations, the Mexican American Youth Organization, Ignacio Perez, Mario Compián, Willie Velasquez, and George Velasquez. We had community leaders like Blandina Bambi Cárdenas, Rosie Castro, Arturo Rodríguez, who was an Edgewood Concerned Parent Association, as well as a board trustee in 1970 through 75, happened to be 24 years old as a board member and was very instrumental in the hiring of Dr. Cárdenas. You have our deepest gratitude, and we wouldn't be here today talking about the Rodríguez case without each and every one of these people and more. I know there's others in the community that have been part of this. So one more round of applause to honor them for their passion and their leadership. I did want to mention that our partners, IDRA, have helped to co-convene the 50th anniversary of the student walkouts, and they continue to archive a lot of this information. You'll see on the back of your program a QR code that will take you to a quick form where we're helping Edgewood collect names of those involved. We know that there are others, and we'll send the link so that you can share with them. Again, thank you to Manuel Garza for helping us with this effort. His community organizing and his leadership has always been there, so we really appreciate that, Manuel. So we're going to transition. I'm going to mention a few more people, but I'm going to get the first panel ready to get going. We're super excited about the 3 panels that we have, and we want to have an interactive dialogue after the panelists kind of address some of the questions that we have. But I can't go on. I did my dissertation in the early 2000s at the University of Texas at Austin, studying the Edgewood cases. Didn't get as far back as the Rodríguez cases. I was really kind of focusing on the Edgewood cases. I was born, I'm going to age myself now. I was born in 1971, right after the district federal court had decided in the favor of the plaintiffs, right? I graduated from high school in 1989, the year of the first Edgewood case winning at the Texas Supreme Court. It kind of gives you an indication, and I'm no different. There's so many of our families that for generations after generations, despite this litigation, this legislative reform has been happening. So I think that's part of our story, not only as San Antonio, I'm from South Texas, so for all Tejanos, I think that's been part of our story. I have to mention the members of the families who actually signed the names on the court case. I think we have to say their names out loud, just like we said the names out loud of the student activists. I'd like to first say from the original court filing, there were 22 adults and there was 15 children. That's Demetrio P. and Helen P. Rodríguez and their son Alexander. Alberta Sneed and her children Jose, Catalina, Angelina, and Selena. Joe and Carmen Hernandez and their children Yolanda, Irma, and Richard. Martin R. Cantu Sr. and his children Linda, Brenda, and Blanche. And then Reynaldo F. Castaño and his children Robert and Steve. Those are the original families and the original children of the Rodriguez case. It's important that we always say their names out loud and remember the activism and the leadership that they did for us back in the day. So with that, we're going to transition to our first panel. I'm going to invite them to come up to the stage. I'm going to introduce our moderator, and then I'll turn the mic over to our moderator. We're very fortunate, again, to partner with IDRA, asking Al Kaufman, Albert Cortez, and Chandra Villanueva to come up with Selena Moreno. Selena is currently the IDRA president and CEO, and she's a former interim Southwest Regional Counsel out Maldev. Selena has a JD as a president, as a national nonprofit organization dedicated to equity and excellence in education. He previously directed policy and litigation, as I mentioned, for Maldev. At Maldev, she also successfully represented Dreamers to defend DACA and against a separate lawsuit that would have invalidated the Texas DREAM Act. Ms. Moreno also served as a trial and appellate counsel in the challenge against inequity and inadequacy in the Texas school finance system. She served as co-counsel in the Texas redistricting case seeking to protect the rights of Latino voters, in a case challenging the conditions and the detention of asylum-seeking women at the Huddle Residential Center, and in the case representing the American GI Forum to reverse a whites-only cemetery policy. She's very accomplished in terms of her expertise on issues related to educational policy, voting rights, basically all the kinds of things that we need right now. It's my pleasure to turn the time over to Selena Moreno and the first panel. She'll do the introductions. Again, thank you for your presence, and we're looking forward to the dialogue.
Bienvenidos. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm so excited about this panel. But first, I just wanted to thank Edgewood ISD for hosting us again, to our partners and co-sponsors, the National Coalition for School Diversity, whose director flew all the way from DC to join us today, and Trinity University, and especially Dr. Enrique Aleman, whose fierce commitment to social justice, both as a scholar but also as a parent and a community leader, is just really inspiring. So thank you to our partners. I also want to recognize the staff of Congressman Joaquin Castro that have joined us today, and the incredible team at IDRA, Christy Goodman, the Director of Communications, Silvia Valencia, also on our comms team. And I'm really excited that on our third panel, you're going to get to hear from our staff on some really useful tools for our collective call to action. I'd be remiss if I did not recognize the Honorable Tino Guerra, who is the chair of the IDRA Board of Directors and worked very closely with our founder at IDRA, Dr. Jose Cardenas. And Mr. Guerra was a former associate superintendent in Edgewood ISD. So the Rodriguez case led to IDRA's founding in 1973. Not everybody knows that, but it is a very important case for our organization. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and we intend to continue the movement that all of the former students that were just acknowledged started, the movement that y'all started for fair funding and equal opportunities for all students, regardless of their skin color, regardless of the zip code that they happen to live in. And as we celebrate our 50th anniversary this year, we carried on that legacy of the students and of Dr. Cardenas. We not only stand on your shoulders, but really the hope that led you to walk out, the courage that you had. We need that today. We need those ganas today, as so many of us, our team members and our allies, are in the Texas legislature testifying right now to keep the public funds in public education. But let's jump into our panel. We have an incredible team of experts here. Um, our panel is going to be on the history of Rodriguez and its impact on our present and our future. You have their bios in the program, but I just want to say a few words about each of our panelists. Dr. Albert Cortez is IDRA's retired director of policy and was also its school finance director under Dr. Jose Cardenas, who literally wrote the textbook on Texas school finance. Dr. Cardenas credits you, Dr. Cortez, for such significant improvements in school funding equity in Texas, and you are a treasure trove of technical experience, of lived experience, and of course, your unwavering commitment to school funding equity. And I've personally witnessed his long hours walking the halls with him at the Texas Capitol, um, you know, preparing the night before the Texas school funding case. Dr. Cortez was a star witness in so many of those cases over the years. And so we're so thankful to have him here with us today. Al Kaufman, another state treasurer, is currently a St. Mary's law professor and a former Maldeff Regional Counsel who litigated many of the famous line of Edgewood cases um, that went after the Rodriguez case. And we'll hear more about that from Al today. The lives of Texas children are better because of you, Al, and I know you've inspired so many people, including myself, to become civil rights attorneys. Thank you for joining us today. And Chandra Kring Villanueva, who is one of my sheroes. She is joining us on behalf of every Texan CEO, Marisa Bono, who was the first Latina school finance attorney to argue before the Texas Supreme Court on a school funding case. Chandra is one of the foremost experts in school finance here in the state and in our nation. And I can tell you from personal experience, when Chandra testifies before a legislative body, whether or not they agree with her, they sit, stop, and they listen to what she has to say. And so excited to dive into our panel discussion. I want to start with you, Dr. Cortez, because before you were Dr. Albert Cortez, renowned school finance expert, you personally experienced some of the school funding inequities in a very real way as an Edgewood ISD student at Kennedy High School. And I know that you saw day to day some of the school funding inequities. I want to hear from you what you thought that Rodriguez revealed about the state of affairs in Texas public schools, and in particular in Edgewood ISD.
Thank you, Selena. Having been a lifelong student at the Edgewood School District, starting at grade 1 till I graduated from Kennedy in 1967, by the way, I'd like to acknowledge that we are at the origins of the Edgewood School District, and I know this is a footprint of the old Edgewood High School Red Raven, and I want to acknowledge the role that many of those students played in pushing for school finance reform over many years. My own experience while I was an Edgewood School District student was that we always had the sense that we had less. And what was communicated to us indirectly then, somehow that we were less meaningful, less important, uh, less able to make a contribution to the future of not only the city, but the state of Texas. And we got that impression by the fact that as we attended our schools, we noticed that our facilities and our buildings uh, were not as nice as schools that some of us got to see when we visited other parts of the city. Sometimes we noticed that our teachers were not as well prepared as other teachers that we encountered in meetings. Particularly, I began to note that when I was in high school and we had the opportunity to compete against other schools and other districts around the city and around the area. And you got the sense that somehow or other things were not equal and that we were not given the same opportunities to learn and achieve as many other children in different communities. I shared a story with Selena that is sadly ironic. I dropped typing. Uh, I took typing because I thought I might be typing to eventually type papers in college. But when I got into typing class, we didn't have enough typewriters for all the students, and we had a typing keyboard painted on the top of desks. And we were supposed to, when we didn't have access to a typewriter, somehow or other practice our keystrokes on that desktop keyboard. That's like typing on a computer without the monitor. Needless to say, I dropped typing after a couple of weeks. Probably why I don't type as well as I should these days. Uh, but that's just a very blatant example of the lack of materials, the lack of equipment, the textbooks we had oftentimes, either they weren't enough to go around or they tended to be more dated than they might have had in other schools. And by the time I graduated, I was very clear that the race that we were going to run with other students from other districts was going to be an uneven race. That students in the Edgewood School District, districts like ours, were going to start at the 10-yard line. But some other students, some other communities were going to start at the 50, 60, and 70-yard line. And then they were going to call the race, and whoever won was going to get the benefits of those advantages that were being provided to some at the disadvantage of the rest of us. And I think subconsciously at that point, I decided if I ever got in a position to do something to change inequity and unfairness in education in all areas, that I was going to uh, fight like hell uh, if I got the chance.
That you have done. After the Rodriguez decision came down, what do you think was the short-term impact of of that decision? What did the advocates and school leaders do after that decision came down?
The when the ruling came down, the special Supreme Court ruling, it was devastating. Uh, we had hoped that, like in Brown versus Board of Education, where the system of segregation was ruled unconstitutional, the system of inequity in funding, we had hoped going through the federal courts was going to go down the same way. Needless to say, the Supreme Court lacked the courage at that point to do what was right and what they knew what was fair. If you all might recall, it was a 5-4 decision. It was very close. Uh, but in that decision, they said, no, it's up to the states uh, to create equity in their system. And they turned the battle into a 50-state battle. The message that came back to Texas is if you want to fix the system, you're going to have to do it on your own turf. And what I think, though, the legacy of Rodriguez was that when the case was presented, a lot of the inequalities that existed in the system were uncovered. It was like turning over a rock, and all the ugliness that was underneath was exposed, all the unfairness, and all of the damage that was being done to children and communities as a result of the inequities. And Texas had been very skillful up to that point at hiding all those inequalities. When the Rodriguez decision came down, even though they ruled against the plaintiffs, it exposed the state for the fraud in fairness that it was. And it also spurred a lot of communities that had not been aware about how bad the situation was, and made collectively many of us realize that it wasn't just Edgewood, but Harlandale and Southside and districts in the Valley, districts in El Paso, districts all over the state were suffering from the same inequalities that Edgewood was suffering. So that exposure put a lot of pressure on the state to do something to clean up its act. But it was very, very slow in responding. I think we're going to be talking about that during the rest of the discussion.
Al, Dr. Cortez just talked about the 50 state battle, and you were at the head of that here in Texas with the Edgewood cases. Can you talk a little bit about how the Edgewood cases relate to Rodriguez and its legacy?
Sure. Well, Rodriguez, of course, was a terrible decision. They made stuff up. President Nixon had appointed 4 new Supreme Court justices, and they basically were already set up to defend the state of Texas in the case. So they said that education is not a fundamental right, that wealth's not a suspect category, and that the Texas system was rational, and it's completely irrational. So that was their opinion. It was still very close, but that's what they decided. I think, as Albert said, it exposed the inequities in the system to a lot of people in the country as well as in the state. There was so much ignorance in the state. I met school superintendents and teachers who had no idea how the school finance system worked. They just knew they didn't have enough money. So that was what happened to Rodriguez. We, they hired me. I came back to Maldiv in 1984, and I didn't know anything about school finance. I remember reading the Rodriguez case 10 years before, and I thought it was terrible. So they brought me in, and they sent me out to IDRA, and Dr. Cardenas and Dr. Cortez tried to teach me about school finance. And you could see the looks on their faces. Like, I'm not going to translate it in Spanish, but I think they're basically saying, why did Maldiv send us this fool? I knew nothing. I didn't even know the right words. So they slowly tried to educate me, and we ended up filing a lawsuit in 2 or 3 months. We tried, though, it was brought under the state constitution instead of the federal constitution, and a lot of the action had been in state courts. So the California Supreme Court had thrown out their school finance system, New Jersey threw out theirs, even Arkansas threw out theirs. So we followed that model and filed our case. And we had an advantage they didn't have with Rodriguez. We had a lot more data because, again, my teachers, Albert Cortez and Jose Cardenas and Jimmy Vasquez from here in Edgewood and Craig Foster in Austin, taught me about this. But we had a data set with all the information on every district in the state, cut thousands of different ways. And we knew that you had to plug the holes. Because in Rodriguez, they picked on, they had a few holes in the data. They relied heavily on studies from Newark, New Jersey, and California, had nothing to do with Texas. They picked at the data. They didn't give a fair example, so we wanted to do it thoroughly. So we did. And that was the case that led to the Edgewood case. I want to say, just to introduce, I want to again thank Albert Cortez and Dr. Jose Cardenas, the teachers, as well as Jimmy Vasquez and Craig Foster, and also the whole Edgewood community for hiring me to work on this case. I became a famous lawyer because I had a good client. Thank God. Uh, and I just learned so much, and very lucky to have the case.
So what did the lawmakers, you talked about the role of researchers and community leaders, of lawyers. What did the policymakers do once the Edgewood cases were
Well,
filed?
we had data because IDRA had done studies for 10 years showing the inequities in the system. So they had educated many of the legislators. They had educated much of the community. Again, then the Equity Center came up and did more data. So the policymakers, the researchers were very, very important. To some extent, the lawsuit was important too, because sometimes these systems have gone on so long that you just can't crack it unless you have a lawsuit. The legislature was too evenly split. Well, it wasn't even evenly split. It was all toward the richer districts and basically the Anglo districts. So anytime there was a new school finance system, they got all their advantages. They kept their benefits. And the only way to break up the system was to go to court. And so that's what we did. So the lawyers were important, the experts were important, the community people were important, and the policy, slowly but surely, the facts of school finance got out into the community, and it was that combination that led us to the Edgewood victories.
Dr. Cortez, is it fair to say that after the legal challenges, it led to greater equalization among the school districts after some of those legal challenges, like the Rodríguez and Edgewood cases?
It was explicitly because of the legal challenges, Selena, that the system actually was revised, reformed. But being very honest about it, it was we we brought the state of Texas into the 20th century, as Dr. Cardenas used to put it, kicking and screaming, uh, as they objected to all of the changes that were adopted. And we didn't get all of the reforms adopted all at once. Uh, we would get some changes made, and then the wealthy district would dig in. We'd come back the next session, educate the community about, well, we had made progress, but there was still level of inequities existed, and the reason they existed, the kinds of things that still needed to be changed. And it took us over the Rodriguez case was decided in '73. It took us until 1983 in bits and pieces to finally make significant changes in the school funding system, which culminated in probably the biggest uh, package of reforms was in 1984 with the adoption of House Bill 72. And in that bill, which was kind of a cumulative uh, effect of years of pushing for changes, the system was substantially reformed. So that's when they uh, adopted a basic allotment instead of funding the system based on teacher salaries. And the reason that didn't work is that high wealth districts could hire teachers with more experience and more credentials and therefore got more money. But they didn't fund the system based on students. We finally got that modified in 1984. In 1984 is also when they added what they call weighted pupil funding, where the needs of special need kids like English language learners, disadvantaged students, special education, kids who are talented, were all uh, there was a formula created that provided extra money for school districts to support those children. But even as good as House Bill 72 was in terms of making changes in the system, it didn't go far enough in terms of equalization. And that would be the tendency of the state. They always take you up to a particular level, and when it got time to make the big jump to full equalization, they'd stop, back off, and water down the equalization features. And that's what happened in '83. And it wasn't until the adoption of recapture, which we'll talk about, I think, in a little bit, that real change came about.
Recapture. Chandra, you are in the thick and have been in the thick of Texas school funding debates, at least since the last decade that we've worked together. You hear all the time the property wealthy school districts complain about recapture, which they call Robin Hood. Can you talk a little bit about what it is, why it is such an important feature of our current system, and why the complaints?
Yeah, so recapture was adopted in about 1993. So that shows you that it was already 20 years from Rodríguez that it took us to even get a mechanism for trying to equalize funding between school districts. And that's exactly what recapture is. It's an equalizing tool. A lot of people think that recapture is the enemy. I live in Austin. Austin ISD is the largest payer of recapture. They're also the largest spreaders of misinformation about the recapture system. So the way our school system works basically is you run everything through a complex formula and you make adjustments to what we call the basic allotment per student funding amount, and then you make adjustments to that for your student populations, your district characteristics, and you come up with an entitlement. And to fill that entitlement, you can think of it as a bucket or a cup, something like that. Your local property tax dollars go in first. If you're unable to fill your cup on your own with local property tax revenue, the state fills it up for you. If your cup overfloweth with local property tax revenue, that's recapture. And that's all it is sort of this skimming of money off the top. But in places like Austin and Alamo Heights, these districts, they're giving sometimes more to the state for redistribution than they're allowed to keep locally. And so they cry and they cry and they daydream about what they could do with all this additional revenue. But what they're not daydreaming about is these school districts down the street that are relying on state aid to get the same amount of funding. So it really is, it's just about leveling the playing field. It's not a punishment. Recapture is not the villain. So if a recapture district is struggling and it doesn't have enough money to make ends meet, that means that every single school district in the state is struggling. Because the problem is not recapture. Actually, when I was a graduate student at NYU, we learned that Texas had the best school funding system in the country because of recapture, because it was so innovative and progressive. And I come to Texas and I'm like, oh, you guys don't think as highly of it as we did up there. Um, so the problem, though, it's not the basic allotment. The problem is, or the problem's not recapture. It is the basic allotment. That per student funding amount is completely arbitrary. It's not based on anything at all. And those additional weights, the funding that we were talking about for special populations, those are also completely arbitrary. The funding amount for our bilingual students is at the same 10% that it was set in 1984 when the system was created. So that's where the problem lays, is that the legislature would rather take the top down than bring the bottom up. So we've been starving all of our schools and then creating this method of dividing us by saying some are wealthy, some are poor, and having districts fight among themselves instead of having all districts come together to fight for adequate funding for all. Because that really, when you focus on recapture, and if you think that recapture is the bad guy, it lets the legislature off the hook from actually adequately funding our schools.
Thanks for making that point, Chandra. I think the other thing I think that would be helpful to know is that when the Edgewood cases were bought, 5% of the districts controlled 25% of the property wealth in all the state. 5% of the districts, a quarter of all the wealth. And those 5% of the districts just had a few 100,000 students. So in the ruling in Edgewood, what was made clear is that local property and the authority to tax local property is really a state role. And they just delegate that to local school districts. As the school board members I know very well know that they can't set the tax rate beyond a particular level where the state says, no, you went over, you've got to roll it back. So the state really does control all aspects of the funding system, including the of property tax base that school districts have available. So on that point, that the only way for the other 75% of districts, or in this case, 95% of districts, to get at that huge amount of taxable property wealth that was controlled by a handful of districts was to find a mechanism to get that money and redistribute it in an equalized basis across the state to all school districts on the basis of need, and that's what recapture accomplished.
I just wanted you all to know that you're here with Robin Hood and Robin Hood. Dr. Cortez and I and Jose Cardenas designed the first systems that ever required school districts to share their property wealth. We did it by counties. Our idea was that every county would develop all of its property taxes, put those in one pot, and then distribute it to the students based on needs of the students. And it's the first time that had ever been done, created more equity than we'd ever had in Texas. We had the Uribe Luna bill, Secretary Uribe and Representative Gregory from San Antonio sponsored that bill, and we didn't quite get it through the legislature, you might guess, but it became the structure for the school finance system as Chandra was talking about that was finally developed that did require recapture, and basically create a lot of equity. If you require Alamo Heights and North Side to put all of their property wealth together with Harlandale and San Antonio and Edgewood and South San and South Side, you get to a much more equalized system. And then if you distribute the money based on the needs of the students, you do a lot there too. We did that in all the counties in the state, create a lot of equity. So you've got Los Albertos here, the Cayo and I, and we just did. We did. So here we go. For better or worse, good
Really important legacy, really important gains that have been made. We know that the system is not completely equitable, and I want to turn a little bit to what can we do to prevent a regression of some of these super important equity gains that have been made since the time of Rodríguez. In 2001, IDRA President Emerita Dr. Maria Cuca founded a coalition, a racial justice coalition for education equity called TLEC. It is currently co-chaired with Every Texan, MALDEF, and IDRA. And there are members of TLEC right now today in the Capitol testifying, as I mentioned, as we sit here, against the bills that would introduce private school vouchers into our system. Chandra, can you talk a little bit about why we as a coalition are opposing those bills and how they would impact the legacy of Rodríguez and the Edgewood cases?
Yeah, definitely. Equity is under attack at all fronts in our legislature right now, today in particular with the voucher fights. So, like, where do you even start with this? There's so much that's going on. Because all of this sort of works together as well. They're not happening in a vacuum. There's this large scale attack on public education and on our ability to fund public education and to move to privatization. One of the worst things that's happened to school finance probably in the last 30 years is the passage of HB3 that happened in 2019. A lot of people think that it was this amazing school finance bill. It was actually a property tax cut bill with a little bit of school funding sprinkled around the edges to trick people into voting for it. And this bill created a system of tax compression, basically lowering tax rates, and it allows school districts to lower tax rates individually. And why that's important is because one of the things that we've gotten through all the Edgewood cases in our litigation history is this principle of equal revenue for equal taxation. And that's sort of one of the building blocks for recapture and state aid was all schools, all students deserve the same high quality education. Every community puts the same skin in the game by taxing at the same rate to pull down the same amount of funding from the state. HB3 decoupled that. So now some school districts are taxing at lower rates than other school districts and getting the same amount of money. It created this whole mechanism for reducing tax rates and shifting the responsibility from the local payers onto the state. The state is now monopolizing that to try to pass all of these extremely harmful property tax cuts and increase the amount of inequity in tax rates between school districts. So that's sort of one front that we're dealing with is this way to completely defund the public education system and put it almost all on the state for funding and make us overly reliant on a sales tax, which is really regressive. And then on the other side, we're trying to pass these privatization bills, these vouchers that take even additional money away from our support for public education to give it to private schools and homeschoolers with absolutely no accountability, not enough money to actually fund private school education. So many families would be left with a tuition gap. I know that I'm from a single mother who had 5 children, and if there was even a dollar gap, the answer was no. If it took transportation or money, the answer was no. So not a lot of families are actually going to be served by these voucher bills. And so that's what a lot of our colleagues are at the Capitol today is trying to fight against this multi-pronged attack on our public education system. We're very, quickly going to this just absolute defunding of the system, and I think that that's all part of the design. They're going to keep cutting the taxes, have less and less revenue to dedicate to schools. So they'll get to a point where the state will be like, well, we can either raise the sales tax to 30% or we'll just give everybody a voucher. And we'll start seeing, University of Phoenix elementary schools opening up in the storefront nearest you that just happens to take the same amount as the voucher and create a whole subpar, predatory level of education, and create even greater divisions within our communities. So it's all kind of this big master scheme to really just attack public education. And it goes on to attacks on our teachers, attacks on our curriculum, attacks on our history and our culture and our people.
We call it the Texas three step, where you're depriving schools of funds, you're demonizing them, and then you're trying to privatize them. That's exactly what's happening right now. I want to hear from any or all of you on, who you think needs to be engaged, and what needs to happen to continue this fight that is really built on the shoulders of so many people here today.
Based on the lessons we learned over 30 years plus, uh, it takes, and it will take, I suspect, a combination of every type of advocate. Uh, the researchers are important. They get to run the numbers, they get to expose the level of inequity. But if nobody sees that information or does anything with it, it's just a bunch of numbers sitting on a page. Uh, Lawyers have to be involved, litigation groups have to be involved, because while the data might show the level of unfairness in the system, it's critical that the legal groups make that connection with what is it that's written into state law that allows those inequities to continue to exist, and what is it within those laws that needs to be changed to make it more equitable. But what I found in my 35 years of advocacy work and coordinating, 'cause I spent a lot of time coordinating, frankly, the work of a lot of people that work a lot harder than I did. And the hardest workers and the most significant workers were the community leaders, the parents, the children, the abuelitas, the tios, the people that live in the communities that are impacted were the heart of the effort. Because as long as they were willing to stand up for their children and what was right, then the state would have to address the issues that they were raising. So it isn't any single group, it's a combination of efforts, as was suggested by other people. But from my perspective, without the community, nothing happens.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I think it's really important for us to all come together. Um, Selena talked about the coalition that we have, but it's the people's voices, it's the families, it's the children who are directly impacted that the legislature needs to be hearing from the most. And again, all they're trying to do is divide us. They want to put people in different categories and in different situations. But when we all band together and demand actual funding for our schools, that we don't privatize our schools, that all of our kids are given the resources that they need to be successful, then we will see change in this state. And unfortunately, there's just been a lot of divisions going on, and it's time for us to all just band together and actually demand that we have adequate funding for our kids and that all of our kids are served. When the legislature calls schools failing, I'm just like, look in a mirror. This is your problem. You're the ones that are responsible for making sure we have a high quality education for all of our kids. We need to stop letting them walk away from their responsibilities and have some accountability for our elected officials. They can't, and like where they're pushing the special ed vouchers is where, one of the areas that we're most concerned about, which is basically the legislature saying we can't, we won't, and we don't want to educate these kids that have a right to the same education as everybody else. So it's a lot about, it's accountability. It's about bringing people together. It's working in coalition. It's bringing your community together to make these demands of the legislature.
Well, I agree with all. Everybody has to work on this. I think those people who do have some expertise in this area do need to keep talking and go out there and meet with people and write op-eds and meet with media and try to work with coalitions, because there is some knowledge of the system which is still not generally distributed. People generally still don't understand it, and I think it's important for those of us who've worked so long in it to keep talking. That's why I'm glad you all are having this forum. I just want to mention one fact. I'm here in Edgewood, which of course is, now I guess is 95% Mexican American, has always been. Um, One fact that sometimes doesn't come out is that one of the reasons for the system was that it hurt Mexicans. Okay, the system, as designed and as implemented, really hurt the Mexican American community. The poor districts were heavily Mexican American, not all, but heavily. And when Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock put out a study showing how there were poor districts all over the state, he's exactly right. People needed to know that. But in a lot of people's minds, especially the legislature, it was still an issue of the border schools in San Antonio. And that we have to get that idea out of people's heads. Now that the state is more than 50% Latino students, it's different. But back then it was 20 or 30%. It was still a minority, and it could still be subjected to a lot of discrimination. So that's one of the facts we need to come out with.
Just reinforcing that point, when we were debating the need for equity early in the struggle, I was talking to some legislators, and they point blank told me they didn't want to go help those Mexican schools down in South Texas. And I had to point out to them very patiently that property poor school districts were scattered all over the state. And it didn't just involve Mexican American predominant schools. There were rural schools that were predominantly white that were also property poor. There were black schools in East Texas, predominantly black schools, also property poor. And the poor were not concentrated in South Texas. They were in North Texas, West Texas, East Texas, Central Texas. And it wasn't a Mexican American problem. It was a statewide problem impacting all students. In fairness, well, you do have a point that the perception was and has been that school finance equity would only benefit minorities. And I think it's really important as the conversations continue, is that school finance equity benefits all of us, not just some of us.
When their kids become our kids, what a world of difference we'll see. Instead of fulfilling his state constitutional duties, we see the governor of our state today paying people to be bused to testify for school vouchers in Austin, so it's incumbent upon all of us to continue, and just thank you so much for all of you that are here today, that are watching on Zoom. Que siga la lucha. Thank you so much to my esteemed panel here, and I'm really excited for the next panel, where we're actually going to get to hear about the activism around this case and from a family member of Mr. Rodríguez. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll transition. Thanks to this panel for setting the stage for us. I'd like to call our next panelists up, Alejandra Lopez, Roy Soto, and Patricia Rodríguez. I'll introduce them on the way up. Alejandra Lopez is an educator, organizer, and president of the San Antonio Alliance of Teachers. Alejandra attended San Antonio Public Schools K-12, earned her bachelor's degree from Stanford, and her master's degree in educational leadership and policy studies as a member of the Urban School Leaders Collaborative at the University of Texas San Antonio. She's been involved in social justice movement across Europe and the United States for over 15 years, focusing on immigration, racial, economic justice, and has worked in education for over 10 years as an elementary teacher. She believes that our public schools are the heart of our communities and continues to organize for greater worker, student, parent, and caregiver and community voice in district decision making. As the president of the San Antonio Alliance, it's really great to have Alejandra join us today. We also have Mr. Roy Soto. Mr. Soto is a former trustee at Edgewood ISD. Is a graduate of Edgewood in the Edgewood School District. He attended elementary, junior high, and high school here, where he was a member of the National Honor Society at JFK, class of 1974. He participated in numerous clubs and organizations and was a class officer. He played and lettered in the following sports: football, basketball, and baseball, and he's also set the city passing record in senior year. Received the following honors: Player of the Year, All District, All City, All State Honorable Mention, Express News, Top 10 Teenagers of San Antonio. He's been a long time community leader, attended Texas Lutheran University as a BA in Finance and Marketing in 1992, and he served in the U.S. Air Force and National Guard. He's been a business owner, 5 retail franchise stores, and Knights of Columbus 4th degree treasurer multiple years. He's very involved with his parish, St. Anne's, since 2005, and he's on the National Advisory Board for the Premier Companies. Dealer of the Year Award 2019 and Top Achiever Award year for 11 years. Thank you, Mr. Soto, for joining us today. And last but certainly not least, very happy to have a member of the Rodríguez family joining us today. Patricia D. Rodríguez is a dyslexia intervention teacher and a 504 co-coordinator at Winston Elementary here in the district. She's worked with Edgewood since 1995 in various roles and is a product of Edgewood ISD, having attended Perales Elementary, Brentwood Middle School, and graduating from JFK. She attended Our Lady of the Lake and has a master's degree in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis in reading. Patricia is also a certified master reading teacher. As a dyslexia intervention teacher, she identifies dyslexic students by administering and interpreting diagnostic tests and instructing students with dyslexia. She successfully provides students with the skills and strategies that enable them to further their reading abilities. And just to tell you a little story real quick, she's had a very tough week, with some family things, and she texted me earlier, said, "I'm coming. I need to be there because I need to make sure that I do this for my dad." So I'm really happy to have Patricia join us today. So we're going to have a conversation. I think the first panel really set us up, to have a conversation about leadership and service in our community. And you all have done that as part of your career, all your careers. Kind of wanted to start with Patricia. The case is named after your family and the legacy of your family's work. And so I think it's always really a good place to start to humanize the person. Just tell us something about your dad. Why do you think your dad and your family was so involved with this case? What can you tell, especially younger generations who most of us have not learned this in school?
Exactly. Yes. So I think I need to just give everyone a little bit of background on who my father and my mother was as well. My father was born in a little town in South Texas that no longer exists. It was called Valley Wells, Texas. He was born in 1925, December 22nd. He and we share the same birthday. And as the youngest and the only daughter, I think that's also another little special bond that we share. And so he grew up a son of migrant workers. He himself was a migrant worker as he grew up, eventually making his way to San Antonio to live with relatives because his own parents, my grandparents, felt like he could get a better education here in San Antonio. And throughout his life, he experienced racism in all its types and forms. One of the stories that he would often tell my brothers and I was that he was also a member of the military. He served in the Navy and in the Air Force. And one day, while he was in the Navy, he was going to go visit my uncle who lives in Hondo, Texas, which is about 80 miles south from here near Uvalde. And while he went to go visit him, he was dressed in his Navy blues. Back then, it was like the little Cracker Jack sailor with the hat and the white bottom pants and stuff like that. And so he wanted to go get something to eat. He went to a restaurant and he was basically told no, that if he wanted to get something to eat, he needed to go to the back in the kitchen, ask for the food where the rest of the Mexicans and blacks were. And this was while he was still dressed in his United States naval uniform. He tried to go to a movie theater to watch a movie, And the same thing happened there. He was told that he could only sit in the back or in the balcony where the rest of the Mexicans and Black people could sit. And so those types of experiences that he had throughout his lifetime really, I think, is what drove him to speak out when he did see injustices and inequalities that were happening not only in our community in Edgewood, but in any type of situation or area. He was, some of you probably do remember him, very outspoken. He was not afraid to speak up when he did see an injustice happening. He always stood up for the little guy. And I think that is what really drove him throughout the years when it came to working for the community, advocating for an equal education and equality, uh, even past the Edgewood case. He would often go before legislatures, attend some of the other Edgewood cases throughout his lifetime, and he just never really gave up as far as advocating for a more equal education, not only for his kids, which it started off as that, but eventually for the whole, not just the community within Edgewood or in Edgewood, but he already was aware that this was something that was going to affect our entire nation. And so I think that is what drove him most of his life, is those types of experiences that he got. My mother, Belen, was a immigrant from Mexico, a little town in Viesca, Coahuila is where she came from. And she worked her way up through, from Viesca to Laredo to San Antonio, working as a maid and as a nanny. And so she also experienced some of those inequalities and racism throughout her lifetime. And even though that she was not English or Spanish speaking, she was only Spanish speaking. She also valued, both of my parents did, valued uh, a good education, and they saw that value. And so one of the things that they both would tell my brothers and I often was that no matter what, a good education can never be taken away from you. You know, the to put it in my father's terms, the white man is going to try to do that. But the more educated you become, the more savvy you are, and the less likely that you will fall victim to those types of racial inequalities. And so they always both made it a point to get us into as much schooling and things like that that would help further and spur us further along in our careers.
Thank you for humanizing that so much. Before I move on to Mr. Soto, I wanted to just follow up because I've always wanted to ask you this. Did he talk about the case a lot when you were growing up? Is that part of the way you were thinking about? I mean, it's a very famous case. I just wonder, of a working class man who was busy trying to raise a family and provide, and is this something that he talked about with you? And did that impact your decision? You're obviously committed to education and to helping others. Did that impact your decision going into the field of education?
So he was a very humble man. He basically worked his whole life to take care of my brothers, my family, and I. He worked at Kelly for many, many years. That's where he retired from and worked his way up the ranks. And so he didn't always talk to us about the case. It was kind of more of like I would see him talk before the press, be invited to go testify somewhere, or maybe to an award ceremony of some type. That slowly I started to realize what was happening. And like you, I graduated from Kennedy in 1990. So when the Edgewood versus Kirby case was ruled in the favor of Edgewood was in 1989, I was a senior at Kennedy, and I very clearly remember being bused to the Edgewood Stadium for a rally that they were having to celebrate that we had finally won. Just to kind of give you some perspective, When this first case was filed, it was filed in 1968. I was not even born yet. I was not born until 1971. So that this whole almost 50 years, right, have gone by, almost my whole lifetime, before we have actually seen some sort of even um, proper equality, if you want to call it that. And so that's one of the things that, just to kind of give you a perspective how long it has been. So he really didn't ever sit down and talk to us about it. It kind of just came out over the years, uh, from seeing him go to things and talking to reporters and things like that. And so, yes, I that is definitely what drove me to become an educator. Um, I've always been kind of like the nerdy kid. Growing up, I loved teaching. I loved learning. And so I always knew that that's something I wanted to do. It's to become a teacher, but even more so growing up in the schools of Edgewood and seeing even then some of those inequalities that I saw, uh, drove me even further to become a teacher and to come back into my community and to work with students that look like me, that speak two languages or more like myself, that live in the communities that I do, that go to the grocery stores that I did, that go to the schools that I did, so that I could make a difference, because I saw that at one point he was very frustrated with the system and the lack of equality and how the state of Texas was dragging its feet to make it fair. And at one point, he just even kind of said, I don't, doesn't really matter what I do or say. I feel like it's never going to change. I'm going to end up dying before there is even any sort of equal funding happening. And so that drove me even more to come back into the district, because I feel like the only way that I can truly make a change is not to wait for the state of Texas or for our politicians to do it, but to put my money where my mouth is, go back into the classrooms, and be not only a teacher, but the best teacher that my students have, and to give them the best possible education, especially the students that I work with now that are already coming to us with a deficit in reading and writing, so that they can feel empowered and so that I can give them those tools so that when they go out into the world, they have a better understanding of what is out there, and they can arm themselves with more, I hate to say ammunition, but more ways of moving up and not waiting for our state to make a change, because I honestly don't think that it's going to happen.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Mr. Yeah, that deserves an applause. And thank you for all your dedication to the community. Let me transfer it over to Mr. Soto as an alumni, right, and a long time. John F. Kennedy, I apologize. John F. Kennedy. Got to be clear about that. Um, people.
Everybody from John F. Kennedy.
Yeah. Okay. I think part of when I have my students, and especially those that are from San Antonio, we don't always realize that there's 17 different school districts in Bexar County, all different sizes. When you think about the size of Edgewood, right? It's a small little district, working class families, really hardworking families. What would you like to share? Somebody who grew up here, somebody who served here as a leader. What would you like to share in terms of what people can learn about the challenges that Edgewood has faced and how they responded to that?
I was listening to your remarks. Something that came back to me was an experience that I had in third grade at Brentwood Elementary back in the early '60s, when I was in elementary. Most of the instructors were Anglo, and one of the I guess one of the one of the things that became very evident is that they wanted to get rid of Spanish in the schools. And in our home, we used to speak Spanish and we used to speak English. We're very fluent in both languages. But what we found is that we had some of the students that um, couldn't speak English at all. And so they'd be in the classroom, the instructor couldn't speak Spanish. And it wasn't important to the instructor that those students couldn't speak Spanish. So they knew that I could. And so they would tap me on the shoulder and they would ask me in Spanish what the teacher was saying. And so I tell them, and they'd wonder what the assignment was, and I would tell them. And then the teacher would come around and they would turn their ring on their ring hand and they would hit me in the head. And they would tell me that Spanish wasn't allowed in the classroom. And so, okay. And so, it was a terrible feeling when an instructor is teaching the lesson and a good portion of the class doesn't understand what the instructor is asking. So it continued to happen. I would look, if the instructor wasn't watching, I would tell him, this is what you need to do. And so that continued. So I continued to get the ring. And then I'd be taken up to the front of the class and I'd get to paddle. And back then you could do that. And so it got to a point where they called my parents in, and the instructor mentioned to my parents that if I didn't cut that out, if I didn't quit speaking Spanish in the classroom, I was not going to be advanced to the next grade. And so that changed everything in our home. Immediately, my folks said, "Okay, we're not going to speak Spanish in the house anymore, and it's going to be all English because your education is very important." So we didn't understand. So, and I really feel, it's sad. I feel sad because I can speak Spanish today, and but what I struggle with is I don't have the vocabulary that I should have. So when I'm speaking Spanish, words escape me. I don't, I can't find them when I need them. So, and that didn't have to happen, but it was taken away from me, and it was taken away from many of the students. Uh, so those were some lessons that I learned early on that somehow something was not fair. And I'll just share another story that when I was a freshman at John F. Kennedy, we uh, we had an incredible coach, very strong on working hard, doing things right, and working on fundamentals. And he told us, we're gonna play some teams that are gonna be bigger, they're gonna be stronger. But if we learn these techniques and if we focus on doing things right and working hard, we can compete. And so he was very tough on us, and so we learned how to do all that very well as a team, and we had an amazing record our freshman year. We were beating, and most of the teams were bigger than we were, and they seemed more talented, they seemed faster, stronger, but we were beating them. And then we went to play against John Marshall, and John Marshall was a brand new school on the north side, and they had a fabulous looking school. The stadium was amazing. We were able to utilize their dressing room to change. We go into their dressing room, and this is the visitors' dressing room, not their dressing room. And I was amazed. I'm walking through this facility, and there's lockers, beautiful lockers, and everybody had their name on those lockers. Beautiful. And then there was an area that was sort of caged, and then we saw their weight room, and it was an incredible display of just you know all the universal type of equipment that you can imagine. And it was like you're one of these big, you're one of these big fancy gyms, and we didn't have any of that equipment. I had never seen equipment like that before. We didn't have anything like that at Edgewood, and so that in itself, becomes a little intimidating. So you feel like, wow, there's enough people at Edgewood telling me, the instructors, that we're not worthy, we're not good enough, we can't speak, our language. And now I'm seeing that these
Physical
people, why,
space.
why, why are these people, why do they have all these benefits? Why do they have this entitlement? And I don't get it at that age. So anyway, we get our pep talk, and we're hearing that this team had a 39 game winning streak. The freshman team for John Marshall. So we're thinking of that as well. And so um, we that means that they had 3 years of perfect seasons. In 1 year, they were one game away from having another perfect season, and they were excited because they were playing Kennedy. So we get out on the field, we do what we're supposed to do, and we end up winning the game. And this was not a good situation. We didn't have a lot of fans that would travel to go watch us play as freshmen. Their stadium was full. Their side was full. When the game was over, we started hearing all these racial slurs. We didn't understand. We won a game, and everybody's screaming at us. The coach tells us, "Okay, let's get to the bus. Let's go get in the bus." So we go, and he says, "Let's run," and we all run to the bus. And there's a lot of the fans for John Marshall that were right there, surrounded the bus, and they're screaming at us. Mexicans go home. You don't belong here, and I can't even remember what else they were saying. But they're around the bus, and they start rocking the bus. And so they had enough people where the bus is rocking back and forth, and they're screaming at us. So we're freshmen. We'd never experienced anything like this. So again, an incredible life lesson there. And our coach, Alan Walsh, an incredible man. Um, he couldn't understand what was happening, and obviously he wasn't Hispanic, but he couldn't believe. And of course, everybody we were looking at, they were Caucasian. He got in that bus, and we took off, and we're racing toward the gate, and he's jumping over curbs, and we're just he's not even looking for the road. He's just going through the field, and we're heading out of the property, and everybody was quiet the whole way home. And then we had a talk, and he talked to us a little bit about discrimination, and he talked about uh, you know I can't remember exactly the words that he used, but he described those
But like
people.
you said, it's a major life lesson.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
thank you for sharing that. I think that when you talk about the different facilities and the different access to programs, that being able to see that, when I teach my students, even today, working in the high schools, young people understand, you know, driving across town to go run in the track meet, they see the differences even today. I want to transition to Miss. Thank you for sharing that, Miss Lopez. I think that the third of our community leaders up here, people who continue to be involved with education. You were also raised here in San Antonio. I've read this about you before, and I've talked to you about this before. Moving away from home, going away to college. You obviously, very accomplished, educated person, have been involved with a number of causes, movement internationally and nationally. When you decided to come back home to be an educator, when you think about the Rodriguez case, and most of us again didn't learn this in school. You have to go away to college and sometimes learn about it.
Or be
What
friends with you.
or be friends? Yeah. What when you think about the Rodriguez case as an educator, what are some of the lessons you think about? And now as a leader of a union, as a leader of teacher leaders and other professionals in schools who are really continuing to serve our community, what break comes to mind in terms of the importance of the case and what we can still learn about that today?
I first just want to say to both of you, thank you for sharing your stories and you telling that story about the football game. It was a movie in my mind, and at first I thought it was like a happy movie, and then it took a turn, and it was a very different experience. I appreciate you sharing that, and I appreciate the question, Enrique, and the opportunity to share. When I think about the Rodriguez case, and when I think about the historical legacy of court cases that have such a tremendous impact on our lived experience. I think for me, the overwhelming lesson is that we cannot just rely on the courts, right? And I appreciated the previous panel really emphasizing this point at the end. Andre Lord says, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And so the work that we do in our union and in our communities is really about understanding that this is about building a multiracial working class movement for education justice, that we have to be active, not only at the Capitol and in the courts, but in the streets as well. And we need to make sure that we understand that the courts themselves are a legacy of white supremacy, of colonialism, of injustices that we are living through every day. And I think we only need to see the Supreme Court and its current makeup at the moment to really understand that if we're going to ever have lasting change, we have to build a social movement. We have to be a powerful force to be reckoned with, right? Because without that, our elected leaders are not going to be held accountable. People in power are never going to, just out of the goodness of their heart, change their minds. They have to be forced and pushed. And honestly, they have to be scared of us, right? They need to be scared of the gente in the streets. And I think we need to see more of that energy. And like was said in the previous panel, right, building this coalition of students, of parents, of community members, and educators is really important. And our union has been really trying to do that work. So the Schools Our Students Deserve Coalition is made up of our union, of parents and students, and community organizations that really see education as one facet of how we can enact social change in our communities. Because we all are here because we recognize that education is important, but it is not going to be the great equalizer. We are a more educated community than we have ever been, and yet we are still not achieving what we can achieve because we're constrained by the social conditions, right? So we can educate our students, we can have equity in the classroom, but if they graduate and all they have access to is, service sector, low paying jobs, ununionized jobs, then what is that education for? And I think in my own personal life, I grew up with the myth of meritocracy, which is something we've talked about, the idea that if you work hard, you can escape your community. And once I got out there, I thought, first of all, there's a lot of white folks out here. I don't know what I'm doing over here. And second of all, I thought, hey, why is my community something to escape? And it sounds like, this is a similar experience. And so I did come back, right? And really working with students now, it's about teaching in a culturally responsive and sustaining to help them understand that our communities are thriving, vibrant places, and that really the real work to do is in our communities, ensuring that we have access to all the resources that we are entitled to and should have, but also that we are enacting change beyond our classrooms and in the societal conditions that we're living in.
Let me ask you a follow up, and then we'll move back this way. Some of the things we talk a lot about in our classes at Trinity, and I know other programs do this, is education is like under assault right now in terms of what's happening. Chandra did a good job talking about what's happening in the legislature. The two L's talked about the history of that and being involved with the fight for that. What continues to drive? This is for all of you. What continues to drive your commitment to working on educational issues? School board member, longtime teacher, educator, and union leader. This idea of critical hope, this idea of maintaining in the face of all the challenges that we're facing. Why do you keep doing the work? And if anything we can learn from the Rodríguez case 50 years ago, we're still talking about the same issue. So what gives you hope? Why do you keep doing this work? Why do you keep working on providing opportunities for other students? And what drives you to do that?
I would say for me, when I think of education, I think of education as liberation, because a key component to my educational pedagogy is developing critical consciousness. The reason that we don't learn about cases like Rodríguez or any other foundational court cases in school is because at the moment our education system is not operating within a culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogical framework. And today, me and two other union leaders who have been doing this work in SAISD for many years met with SAISD curriculum folks to really finish creating a robust CRPS framework for our district, because our fundamental belief is that our students, particularly our working class Black and Brown students, should have access to a culturally responsive and sustaining classroom all across our district, and I would say all across the city, the state, the country, right? They need to be learning why their neighborhoods look the way they do. Because as you mentioned before, when you grow up, and I grew up on the Southwest side, I went to Southwest High School, right? When you grow up in a school like that, you internalize that that's what you deserve, right? You internalize the idea that your school looks the way it does because you don't deserve any better, because you don't know about historical oppression and injustices. And so, the reason I became an educator is because I wanted to be that teacher that I didn't have, right? Because I also had teachers that perpetuated a white supremacist assimilationist curriculum in my classroom, and I was successful despite of them, not because of them. And I became an educator because I knew the kind of teacher that I wanted to be, and I knew the kind of education I wanted to provide for my students. And I saw the magic happen in my classroom. But it's not enough for it to happen in one classroom, in one school, in one district, right? It needs to be happening in every classroom. And I would say that we do professional development with educators in SAISD, and I am continuously encouraged and inspired by people's commitment to do this work. Even though many of them didn't have this kind of education. I was an ethnic studies minor in college. That's how I learned a lot about this. So even though they don't have that background knowledge, they understand the necessity of this work. And so I know that if we are teaching in a critically conscious way, then our students will continue, just like they have since the students at Rodríguez and the walkouts, to demand equity and justice for our communities. And so that's why I continue to do this work.
Mr. Soto, let me ask you the same question. What continues? Yeah, you deserve. What continues to give you the hope, right? You've been part of this community. You've been on the board. You continue to serve in other ways with your church and with other organizations. What continues to give you hope, given all the systemic and historical oppressions that our communities have faced?
I've been very blessed over the years. I've always had thought partners. I've always had mentors that have helped me as I've moved through life. And I've always been encouraged that if you work hard, you focus on doing things right, and you understand that you're going to stumble, but you need to have the strength to pick yourself up, brush yourself off, and keep moving forward. And so one of the reasons that I came back to Edgewood, one, my wife told me that's your district, and they need some board of managers, and you need to go help. I said okay. Um, but what makes it important for me is that I think that it's the kids that somebody like them is having some success in life, and and it's important to me to be a thought partner, to be someone that can encourage you if you're struggling and help you if I can. So that's been very important to me, and and I see that in our children. We are blessed here at Edgewood. We have an amazing trustee team. We have an amazing superintendent and an incredible executive team. Um, and they're so engaged. They're so engaged in the community and in the classroom. Superintendent goes out with a number of of executive team members and some other personnel from the district. The police department shows up. They go into communities. He moves around to all the schools and visits the communities, seeks out the matriarchs of of that particular community and asked to see if they would host us. And the district comes in with tables and chairs, and they will bring food, and they were asked to invite the community. And we have pláticas there. That's what the superintendent does. And it's a very simple agenda. There's only three questions. It's not about him, sharing any information. He wants to know what they like about what's going on in that particular school. What do you like about what we're doing here? And then he'll ask, what is it that you don't like that we're doing here at this school? And what would you like to see us do differently? And he does that, and he moves around to all the schools throughout the year, and he looks for that matriarch. And this is how we're changing the culture here at Edgewood, because they recognize that the Edgewood leadership group and teachers and everyone, they recognize how important the family is. And we know that if we're going to teach children, we have to teach families. And if we're going to teach families, then we better teach mom, because mom is going to control that family. So we're very engaged. We're very engaged in helping moms get their GED and helping them so that they can help their children. And that concept also is in the classrooms. The superintendent goes to schools and he has lunch with the kids. And we're fortunate that we get invited sometime. The trustees get a chance. A few of them. He doesn't want to bring too many people in. But again, he's asking the same questions, and it's amazing. I was sitting right here with we had tables. We must have had 10 tables here, and we had a bunch of the fine arts kids, and they were high school kids, and we sat there, and I was at a table, and I was sort of facilitating, and I had three questions to ask, and it was amazing what came out. And then the superintendent asked us to ask the kids if anyone wanted to share their story. So out of each table, kids said, "Yes, I want to share my story. I want people to know what I think we need here and what I'm really excited about, what we'd like to see change." And so that happened here, and it happens in our cafeterias from elementary all the way to high school. And we learned a lot, and they really appreciated the fact that we made them feel important. They felt more worthy because here are the leaders of the district that want to know what's important to you. What do you like? What don't you like?
Yeah, I think the community based and the ability to have conversations and not only have conversations but listening, right? Listening to community members, listening to young people, the youth, the voices that oftentimes are not part of the conversation is a really key aspect that you're mentioning. And I kind of relate to, again, going back to the 60s and 70s, right? It was being these conversations were already happening in community, and the leadership was there. Let me ask Ms. Rodriguez about um, a similar question. I'm going to tweak it a little bit because you mentioned earlier, and I was struck when you said that you remember your father, getting down and saying why, questioning why is it that I did this, being frustrated by the way the state was dragging its feet, being frustrated that all the service and the activism and the coalition building that had happened had not generated what it should have generated. And so I can understand the frustration. I can understand the losing of hope. But if he was here, he is here spiritually, right? But if he was here physically, what do you think he would say with the fact that we continue to fight at the state level? We continue to struggle at a community-based level. Would he? I love the fact that you said that he wasn't afraid to say what he needed to say. I I I I love that. But what do you think he would react to in terms of 50 years later, the fight that continues in our communities?
I don't think I can actually say what
You
he
can
would
say it.
probably say. Like I said, my dad was very outspoken.
He just called it like it is, or he would
He did. Some of you that did know him knew that he was
with colorful language, or
with very colorful language, mostly aimed at the bolillo or the white man. So I will say though that he would definitely not be happy with what is happening right now, with the way that our state and our politicians in our state are trying to politicize education, are trying to demonize our teachers, and that are trying to take away what little we already have in districts like Edgewood as far as the monies and the push of these voucher systems that will not only, you know, for lack of a better word, discriminate against our students in communities like ours, but also discriminate against the students that already have these special needs. And so he would literally, I believe, would be rolling in his grave right now, knowing that what is happening and how 50 plus years later, some things have not really changed. And the change that we have managed to get within this lifetime of 50 years is slowly starting to deteriorate, and how basically the system is right now, the educational system is under attack. And so, I would also like to say, um, I think it is very important so that our community, especially the students that we have right now in high school, for those students to learn about this history, to learn about these students that were very brave to walk out of their classrooms, um, and the parents that joined my father and the other community members to bring this fight on, because that's the only way that you're going to truly understand the importance of this, as well as the educators. It blows my mind when I talk to teachers about, my dad and this very, it's kind of, I think it's been called like the most unknown Supreme Court case
Yeah.
you've never heard of. Um, because as a teacher, you need to educate yourself to understand how the system, how schools are funded, and how that matters to you, because it should matter to you. Um, we would not have a job, right, if we didn't have our students in the classrooms. And the attack that our system is under right now not only affects the students, but it affects us as educators. And, whether you think that it's not going to affect you because you already went to college, you already went to high school. My kids don't come to this district. They go to a parochial school or they go to a school in Northside or Northeast. It is going to affect you. These kids in districts like Edgewood, in our communities, are not just going to stay here in this community or in Edgewood. They are going to travel around to different places, to different countries, to different cities. And eventually, those kids are going to grow up to be parts of the community, to be hopefully leaders. um, but it is going to affect not just the people on the west side, no nomás la gente, pero a todos, nos afecta a todos.
Thank you so much. There's never enough time. I could talk to you all day, but I know we need to transition. Before we do, I know your brother showed up, so I wanted you to acknowledge him for us.
Yes, my brother, Alexander Rodríguez, who was on the
original court case.
Yes, he's the oldest of the family.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. We'll transition to the last panel. One more round of applause for Ms. Rodriguez, Ms. Lopez, and Mr. Soto. We'll call up some of our friends from IDRA. And I'm going to let them take the mic because we're going to do an interactive kind of dialogue here. I am going to just say one thing because this is the first person I met at Trinity University. She was an undergrad and she's graduating from UT Austin master's program and is a graduate of Edgewood. So Diana Long is now a policy fellow for IDRA. Very proud of her, and she'll be leading the discussion here.
Hi everyone, how's everyone doing? It's been a good discussion, 2 panels. So let's get started. Are you here? So it is an honor to be here, and I am accompanied by Morgan Craven, who is our National Director of Policy at IDRA, and Joanna Sanchez, who is going to be showing us some data points on the status of school finance in Texas today. And she's back there. And like Dr. Aleman said, my name is Diana Long, and I'm so honored to be here. This is home for me. So it's so good to be back. I'm going to share a little bit about myself. And thank you, first of all, for the opportunity that you have given me to speak to you. So this being here means so much to me, and I will explain some of the reasons why. It is a tremendous privilege and honor to be here in front of you, the Edgewood community, and all the people that made it possible for me to accomplish so much. I really stand on the shoulders of you giants. I graduated from John F. Kennedy High School in 2017. I attended Alonso Perales Elementary, and I also attended Brentwood. I then continued my education at Trinity University, and I graduated with a bachelor's degree in May of 2021. I now attend the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm earning a master's degree in education policy, and that graduation is coming up, and I'm so excited. Trinity was really transformative for me. It was a moment where they came in with a lot of challenges. I feel like all the odds were against me. I was a first generation college student. I was low income. My parents were immigrants, and it was hard. Trinity is a predominantly white institution. I felt really out of place, and I found comfort when I ran into people who were also from San Antonio. I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're also from this town. So good to meet you." And as I got to know them, I realized that yes, we were from the same city, but we were not the same. They had access to more AP courses. They had the shiny new tech. They had applied to and visited way more colleges than I even thought existed. So I think at that point, that was a moment in my career where I decided that I wanted to dedicate my career to figuring out why and why these disparities continue to exist. So this is my job now at IDRA, and I'm so happy to be a part of such an amazing team. I have an amazing mentor with me right here, Morgan, Joanna, Chloe, everyone. So I'm just so grateful for the opportunity. Thank you. Oh yes, and those are my parents. They're in the back over there. Okay. Okay, so let's see how I'm going to pass it on to Morgan. She's going to explain a little bit about how school funding works here in Texas today.
Thank you. And I awkwardly sat over there because I wanted to be able to see the slides, but I think I'm just going to move over here. And I just want to acknowledge someone that Deanna just mentioned, Dr. Chloe Sykes, who is our Deputy Director of Policy and leads our Texas policy work at IDRA. She was supposed to be here today. We missed her. She is in Austin right now, as you may have heard. There are a number of voucher bills that are being heard right now. I just read on Twitter there are 400 witnesses. She is stellar and probably the best one, but that is where she is. And I'm excited for all of you to get to meet her and work with her in the future. We're going to be talking about some action steps at the end of this. But first, as Deanna mentioned, we just want to kind of give a picture of school funding today and what this is looking like in Texas schools. So slide, please. Thank you. So this is a picture of the diverse students in our Texas public schools. Texas educates about 1/10 of students in the country, most of whom are children of color and from communities with limited wealth and income, as you can see. 1/5 of our students in Texas are emergent bilingual or English learner students. And I think this is really a picture of diversity. It's a picture of the limitless potential of Texas's children who are assets to their schools and communities. And before we kind of get into the school funding and talking about the inequities there, I just want to be clear that we all know that in schools across the state, these students are supported by their families and communities and have many amazing teachers, some of whom you heard from today, and school leaders. But the reality continues to be that many of these students attend schools that are under-resourced by a system of school funding that perpetuates inequities. Next slide, please. So you heard Chandra talk about this in such a beautiful way, cups overflowing. But just to set the stage a little bit and give a bit of background level setting around the basics of school funding. Texas public schools are funded by local funds, state funds, and some federal funds. And the state determines the basic level of per pupil funding for the average Texas student. You heard that described as the basic allotment. And it's important to repeat, because you've heard this before, that this number is not based on cost studies or what we know it takes to actually educate students. Um, the basic allotment currently, as you'll see, is $6,160. That is not consistent with any cost studies that show what it takes to educate a student and educate them well. There are additional funding weights for certain groups of students that you can see there. So emergent bilingual students, for example, have an additional 10% of funding on top of that basic allotment. And as Chandra mentioned, that number has not changed since 1984. There are also additional weights for students in dual language programs, whether or not they are emergent bilingual or speak English as their home language. There are weights for students in poverty, weights for special education students who receive special education services, and a special dyslexia weight as of 2 sessions ago. So school districts generate funds through collecting local property taxes. And after those local taxes are collected, the state provides additional money to the school districts that were unable to collect enough money through those local taxes to meet that basic minimum per pupil funding amount. Next slide, please. So here's where we see more systemic inequities. And again, we heard about these before, but they bear repeating. We know that historically, properties were intentionally valued higher in white communities and lower in communities of color. So resources, services, and other investments were poured into the wealthier communities, building on that wealth even more. And this understanding was at the heart of the Rodríguez case and what we've heard so many of the panelists talk about today. So property wealthy districts have a relatively easy time collecting local funding. Because the values of the property in the district are so high, they're able to collect a significant amount of money for their schools, even with a relatively low tax rate. Districts with low property values, on the other hand, have a tougher time doing that. So they have to tax the people in their districts at a higher rate in order to generate the same amount of money as the wealthier districts. And high wealth districts, you heard about recapture, but high wealth districts are able to hold some of those funds in their district and use them to provide their students with all sorts of materials and opportunities and instructors that other students in low wealth districts cannot access. Next slide, please. We know that we have an inequitable school funding system and one where many students' basic needs are not being met. As I mentioned earlier, our state funding formulas are not based on cost of educating students, and they don't even account for inflation. And the share of money that the state is even putting into our school funding system is decreasing over time, leaving many districts struggling to serve students. Next slide, please. You will see here Texas ranks 40th in the nation in per student funding levels. So, and I just want to underscore this, 40th in the nation, but we are a state that currently has a $32 billion with a B dollar surplus in our budget, and we are the 9th largest economy in the world. But we fund our students 40th out of the country. On average, that means local, state, and federal resources amount to about $12,645 per student, though that actual number varies by district. And just to give you kind of a scale, by contrast, New York spends over $25,000 per student. So this is where Texas schools, students, and families are today. You cannot see her because she's behind a computer, but I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague back there, Dr. Joanna Sanchez, because we wanted to take some time to show you visually what this looks like when it's mapped out across Texas and across the San Antonio area.
Thank you, Morgan. So yes, to visualize the school finance landscape that Morgan has just described, we want to share with you some resources that we have developed that will allow stakeholders to engage with the data and gain a better understanding of how the school finance plays out in their district and in their community, and then even across the state. So first off, we mapped the top high wealth districts and the bottom 100 low wealth districts. And similarly to like what panel the participants in the first panel said, um, the understanding initially was just that, oh, it's the poor districts in the valley that are needing help. And here, this shows that poor districts, especially these bottom 100, are spread out throughout the state. And similarly, rich districts are spread out throughout the state. And you see that in West Texas, there's definitely a concentration of, of that. Um, and then we wanted to zoom in to Bexar County. And the story continues. Harlandale and Somerset are still two districts from Bexar County that are in the bottom 100 low wealth, and Alamo Heights continues to be in the top 100. So we figured showing you visually what that looks like could be helpful. And again, these are just static maps. So to take this to the next level of having it be interactive and putting this information in your hands, we put together interactive maps that show, as Morgan was just talking, how schools are funded. There's a share of local funds, there's a share of state funds, and how better to engage with this data than putting it in an active map where you're able to zoom in to any district within Texas. I'm going into there just because this, you will recognize all of these districts. And you can then see uh, the different percentages of local and state funds per district, and you can see how neighboring districts differ uh, or not differ from one another. So again, this is all upcoming. We will be releasing this to the public so that stakeholders can engage with it and ask questions and dig deeper into the data. And again, the way it's going to work is that if you click on your district, you'll then have a table pop up that has information about your district. And we'll be adding demographic data there too to kind of, that you can see, are you comparing apples to apples? Kind of get a little bit more context of what's happening within that district. So back to this. Then we also have one for bilingual education funding. Similarly, Morgan was just talking about how there's different, it looks different for each district. And so there's different allotments for bilingual education. And so that can be for emergent bilingual learners, dual language allotment, a non-emergent bilingual learner, dual language allotment, or regular bilingual allotment. And some districts don't get any allotments because they're not providing that service of bilingual education, but many do. And so again, the same scenario, you'll be able to engage with the data by clicking on a district and then getting information and all the details about that district in regards to the funding. And then third, we have a special education funding map. And so this one, you'll see that special education fundings or services are needed across Texas. And yes, there is some areas that have a greater concentration, but very much a service that districts need to be able to provide. And so here again, the same idea. You'll be able to get more details about the district and the special education funding, the block grant that districts get to serve the students in their district. So yes, it'll be available for you to explore and see how you can then leverage this information, uh, within your communities. Let's see.
Awesome. I think let's give Joanna a round of applause because she is the data queen. Every time we ask her any question about, hey, how many this and this are in Texas, literally within 5 minutes, she can figure it out. So thank you so much. Like Joanna said, these resources will be available to the public in hopefully by the end of the week. So y'all can share them with people, your community members, your organizations. That would mean a lot because once you see it in numbers and you actually see the disparities, I think it speaks volumes. So on that note, I think it's important to reflect on the impact that Rodriguez case had. Like, it was a terrible ruling, unfortunately, but I think it also fanned the spark that community members and families set for many generations to come. If next slide. So as it was mentioned earlier, it's the state is constitutionally held responsible for creating and sustaining a public education system that serves all students, especially students of color and low income students. Yet the state continues to underfund schools, support inequitable systems, and promote schemes that take public money out of public schools. Just today, as we discussed the long history of inequitable funding in public schools, the Texas Senate is holding hearings as we speak. And have you heard a little bit about that earlier? Voucher programs are programs that take public funds out of public schools with no accountability, no transparency, and we need to oppose them. Next slide. One more, please. So these are just another of the current challenges. School funding formulas are not based on any real cost. They just come from arbitrary numbers. As you all know, the cost of everything is continues to rise, gas, food, and it's no different for education. So we should encourage the legislator to continue to fund students adequately and invest in the basic allotment and raising those special student weights that students need to be successful. And it should also be adjusted for inflation. And there's current legislation that Chandra has been working on really hardly, and we're really pushing for in the Texas legislature. Next slide. Texas is also failing its teachers. We are in a room full of educators, and educators are leaving the classroom left and right because they feel unappreciated. They're not being paid enough. So we need to see a bigger investment in teacher recruitment and preparation to address the teacher shortages, especially in high need areas like bilingual education, STEM education, and special education. And last but not least, school districts must ensure transparency in their spending decisions, but also include families in those decisions so that they can participate in policy and practices that affect their students every day. And I think I'm going to hand it out to Morgan to give us a call to action. I think it's important now more than ever where is at a crisis. I think it's under attack. So I'm going to pass it on to her to share about some of the opportunities that we can be engaged.
Thank you. So one thing that I really appreciated about all of the panels and all of the introductions at the beginning was just the deep and long commitment to advocacy and activism, and how that is illustrated in the room through all of you. Um, we have heard a lot and learned a lot this evening, and now it is time to act. And I know that there are very different ways that we can do that, and some of the panelists pointed that out. Each of us brings skills and talents and knowledge to this fight, and working together, we can touch all of those areas and really come up with a robust challenge to what continues to be an inequitable school funding system in Texas and across the country. Next slide, please. So we thought of a couple of ideas, a couple of calls to action for all of you, and we're going to take just a few minutes after I shared these few slides to hear from you, whether you have questions, reflections, thoughts about any of the panels or what we have just presented to you today, or your own calls to action based on the work that you're doing in your community or through your organizations or coalitions. One thing that we can all do is take this opportunity to network and to fellowship with each other, and really connect with each other and figure out what we're doing in each of our spaces. We listed a couple of organizations here just because we had them, here on the panels, and very happy to co-convene this event with them. But all of these organizations have really important materials. They do legislative updates. They do community updates. They are excellent to follow on social media if you are into that. Certainly IDRA Trinity University, the Center for Educational Leadership, Edgewood ISD, the National Coalition on School Diversity, Every Texan, the San Antonio Alliance, MALDEF, and there are materials outside where you can figure out folks' contact information, social media handles, so we can all stay connected. And we want to hear from any of you that are part of organizations or coalitions that aren't listed here. You saw the interactive maps that Dr. Sanchez just presented. We have all sorts of data resources, infographics, issue briefs, explainers, so that you can understand and share with others in your communities and young people in your communities information about our school funding system and our education system, so that we can all have the tools to be able to access information, data, research, participatory action research that's really driven by community members, and have that ability to understand school funding and other educational issues in our community. Knowledge is really, really key for us to be able to move forward and act. Next slide, please. We all have to continue to organize. We have this beautiful legacy of organizing right here in this room, and we have to continue that fight. We've heard that from so many panelists. So we have to continue to build intergenerational and really youth-led coalitions that are focused on pursuing fair funding. I listed here one model that IDRA uses, education cafes, which help bring together community-based groups in order to push for change locally, which we'd be happy to talk more about. But I know there are so many local organizations, community-based organizations that are really building, again, intergenerationally, leading and teaching young people to be involved in this. And that's incredibly important for this movement. You can follow and join coalitions. There are all sorts of coalitions that are both local and statewide and national and even international that do really, really important work and support really important work. You heard about one earlier from the first panel, TLEC, the Texas Legislative Education Equity Coalition. We're missing a word there. There are two E's. Education is key. And that's a coalition that we co-convene at IDRA along with Every Texan and MALDEF. It's a statewide, cross-issue coalition that's focused on racial equity in education. And we would love for you to follow, join, really keep up with what is going on, particularly now during the legislative session. And so that's one really concrete way that you can stay active, get involved. And then, of course, let us all know, every organization in this room, let us know how we can support your work. If you are at a school and have a need for, if it's a presentation, if it's for pulling people together, if it's for sitting down and talking with young people about school finance, there are ways that we can all support each other's work. And so we have to tap these incredible resources that we have right here in this room. Next slide, please. And then finally, we are in a legislative session, as I've now mentioned like 6 times. It's really in my brain. There are hearings happening right now. And one thing that we say at IDRA is everybody is a policy advocate, and we have to see ourselves that way. So we have a right to go to Austin, and we have a right to go into the Texas Capitol, and we have a right and a responsibility to talk to legislators and tell them the change that we want to see. We have a responsibility to say what's happening in our districts. We have a responsibility to, expand that proverbial table to young people and make sure they are part of the process and understand the process, and it's not something scary, but that we demystify that process for them. And so, we're doing that right now. We're doing it right now, and you can do it right now. Find your representatives and contact them, whether they're at the state level, whether they're local elected officials. Testify at hearings. Anyone can go to the Capitol and testify. Anyone can go to a city council meeting and testify. Anyone can go to a school district board meeting and testify. And so there are opportunities for you to engage with the system even as we work to change how it fundamentally works. And then finally, I think what is key is for all of us to focus on supporting young people who are interested in being more involved in what's happening at their schools. We heard from teachers and advocates and researchers and data folks. There are young people who are out there who are just doing amazing work and who want to do amazing work and who are organizing and doing their own research and going to speak at hearings and doing all of this incredible movement building. And whatever we can do to support them. And young people in the room, please tell us what that is. Whatever we can do to continue to support young people, that's a critical group of people who are impacted by every single decision that is made, and so they need to be part of every single decision that is made. These are a few calls to action that we came up with. And again, I want to open it up. We have just a few minutes before we close out. If there are any thoughts, reflections, comments, questions, or other ideas that folks have for what we can collectively do to make sure that we are honoring the amazing legacy of everyone in this room, everyone who is unable to be here, who has worked so hard and fought for so long for equity, educational equity and justice in our state. Yes. I don't know if we can get you a mic, but if you say it, I will repeat it. Oh, someone's coming to you. Perfect. Thank you.
My name is Mary Lou Rodriguez, and my name is Mary Lou Rodriguez, and I'm the proud wife of Arturo Rodriguez, the gentleman that you saw the name Rodriguez over the board there. He was one of the signers that went against the city, the Austin, to get equal education for our children. And we went. They filed a lawsuit. His he was on the board of trustees. They filed a lawsuit, and we went on a march. We did a big march, uh, and we've walked on the Capitol of Austin. And our motto was equal education is a right. And we were very loud about it, marking down the road. And but also it produced some very positive things. So yes, it's important if you see something that's wrong, that is a wrong, not educating our young children, using the monies for other things, uh, to speak up and get up and participate in trying to right any wrongs that you see within the system.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We're going to have you lead our march to the Austin Capitol. I love it. Thank you. Yes. Should I hand you this? Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I miss someone? Would you like to take this one? Thank you.
I'm just going to stand. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Valdez. I'm a school board trustee for Edgewood ISD. I'm also a student at San Antonio College. This is the very campus that I graduated high school, and I had my graduation ceremony here a few months ago in June. So today, I did have the opportunity to listen to the, the recording that was done by Selena and Dr. Cortez, but it's still unequal. Like our education, how we're educating our students, the facilities that um, across the state of Texas and in Edgewood, it's still unequal from our neighbors, like in Northside, SAISD, all the other school districts are either upgrading their facilities or rebuilding them, and that's just really unequal, and it's just not fair for our students here in Edgewood ISD. Um, Another thing that I was touched on from Mr. Cortez when he was saying that they didn't have typewriters, and it's still the same except without typewriters, it's books, and you have to share books or take pictures of the books because you can't take them home. And like being a new school board trustee and just learning about how bonds work, the Chapter 41 school districts, how the districts, oil-rich districts, basically get their schools built from like oil tax instead of the property tax owners, kind of like raising the bond on their backs. Because in Edgewood, it's gonna be hard if we ever do a bond. Um, learning about Edgewood back in the 60s, veterans, they sacrificed their life for us, dying in the Vietnam War, and just wondering like what they would think, like the facilities that we have while we're educating our students that have the opportunity to go to school, attend college, and live on their life. Um, I don't know, just maybe the recapture. Still confused about it a little bit because it's like 4%, but instead of helping like districts, small districts, low property level districts, it's just going into a bucket. But like in Carrizo Springs, um, Cuero, ISD, um, another school district. Just like they can rebuild their facilities like without having to worry about how they're gonna pay it back in years. It's just difficult, and also like how Mr. Aleman said, he teaches their students when they're in the north side, they can tell based on the facilities they have. They have tennis courts, fancy tennis courts. They have um, new facilities, new theaters. It's just not fair. Like when you people are moving to the north side, they get to have a brand new high school, but the kids that have lived in their homes for like hundreds of years still get the same thing that we've had since the walkout. I'm kind of glad that I attended this school because in the 90s, I believe there was a bond to upgrade the school a little bit, but it's still not the same with what school should be for every student, regardless their school district. And in San Antonio, we do have like 17 school districts, and I believe that's also like hurting our students. The state, from what I've learned as being a trustee, I do a lot of trainings. They give us 5 options, and one of the options, if you can't raise the money or like do it on your own, you either consolidate your tax base, which I don't think we've ever done here recently, but that's a possibility, or just consolidate with another school district. So thank you, everyone.
That's awesome. Thank you. And thanks for your service. And don't worry, everyone in this room except for 10 of us is confused by school funding. So I think we have time for one more before we close out. So thank you so much.
Okay, good evening. I'm Rosendo Gutierrez, and I'm one of the student council members of the Edgewood High School class of 1968. We were the ones that were tired of posing our grievances to our high school principal and superintendent. We got tired enough that we rallied and got a group of people involved to walk out. But I'm so grateful that we had tonight because, for one thing, it says we need to stay engaged. And many of Edgewood's graduates not have gone out, gained their education, and have come back to the school district to teach. Many of our graduates have gone out and developed their careers, have left the community like I did for 20 years when I was in the military. But I have come back. I've come back to this community, and I've still engaged myself in community service through the Edgewood District Veterans. There are other organizations within the Edgewood community that are not the abuelas, they're not the parents, and they're not the students, but we are the alumni. We are those that have left Edgewood but have not forgotten. And so I just want to challenge everybody who's part of this group to stay engaged. And I really appreciate the information that IDRA has sent me. And I'm very proud to be here. And I want to thank you.
Thank you so much. And what a perfect closing message to stay engaged. Thank you all so much. And I'll pass it back to you. Oh, Selena's in there. I pass it back to Selena.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Joanna, for sharing those important tools with us in this important conversation. Mr. Valdez, you mentioned a podcast that I did with Dr. Cortez. The data tools that were shared here today, the podcast that we just referred to on the Rodríguez case, can all be found on IDRA's website. It's so important for us to continue to be our own advocates. Everyone is a policy advocate, to share our own stories and be our own historians. And you can find on our website as well, and there's flyers in the back, information about IDRA School Resource Hub, where we share lesson plans with teachers about our very important history, where we share tools for advocacy. And so we remain committed to telling our stories, to democratizing data. It's so important to do so, because it is confusing, right? And it's made to be that way, right? That not everybody wants us to have our voice heard. And so we, remain committed today, and we all recommit to carry forward the ganas and the hope, that so many of you here today, that walked out in 1968, the families, that filed the case, shared with us today. And so I want to thank you, and I want to invite you to an upcoming forum. Next month, on April 19th, we'll hold our IDRA Dr. Jose A. Cárdenas School Finance Fellows Program Symposium. Our fellowship is meant to continue the research that was started that helped lead to these legal challenges, and it is in honor of our founder at IDRA, Dr. Jose Cárdenas. On April 19th, our two fellows, Dr. David Martinez and Dr. Vanessa Sonson, will share their research. It's going to be a virtual event, and we'll have details on our website. So please go to our website for information on the podcast, on our school resource hub, and some of these tools today. Thank you again so much, to the Rodríguez family, to Edgewood ISD, to Trinity University and Dr. Enrique Alemán. Y seguimos la lucha. Adelante. Thank you so much for being here today. Adelante.
So,